Mr. John Oakes, I'm happy to be with you now, and especially that going through some of the writings you did. So how about the church history book you just published?
Yeah, I just published that in June. It took me a couple of years to write the book. The reason I wrote the book is because I wanted to make church history accessible for Christians in general. The title is The Christian Story, Finding the Church in Church History. And so kind of the theme of the book is that we can study what happened in the past with the Christian movement and use that to inform how we should do church in a modern context. So that's kind of the overall theme. Eventually there'll be 3 volumes. This is just volume 1. It covers the very early church through 457 AD, which is the Council of Chalcedon. In the first chapter, I'm talking about the first century church. There, the primary documents mainly are the New Testament. So I'd spend some time talking about how the church spread, the different places it went to, the different issues and problems that the church dealt with, and a discussion of from a rational perspective, why the church was able to grow so incredibly quickly against all odds. So there's talk about Paul's ministries, dealing with heresies such as Gnosticism and Ebionites and those kinds of things. The first chapter is fairly short simply because I'm assuming that probably most of the readers are fairly well aware of church history in the first century because our main document is the book of Acts. And then I get into the second century, and here we start to come across writers. So we have early church fathers such as Clement of Rome, who wrote letters to the churches, or we have the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, the letters of Ignatius, Polycarp, the martyrdom of Polycarp, the writings of Justin, the early apologists like Diognetus and Athenagoras. So there we start to have information from that probably Christians tend not to be particularly aware of. And so we see some of the movements that came up in opposition to sort of mainstream Christianity, Gnosticism, the movement of Marcion, who was kind of a bit of a Gnostic. Anyway, there are a number of different groups that were opposed to Christianity. Montanism, which was kind of like a charismatic movement in the second century. And as we look at that, at the second century, you can see the church trying to respond to these pressures, not mainly, believe it or not mainly from outside of Christianity. Most of the pressures and problems within Christianity were coming from within. So the church was trying to defend itself from these false teachings, and in the process they developed a strong monarchical bishop. That's a big fancy word, but basically by the second century you had bishops heading the church, and evangelists took a much less role. The church became more formalized. Individual participation in worship lessened, and it wasn't because the church was trying to destroy Christianity. Far from it. These were absolutely sincere Christians trying to do the best they could, but they were trying to deal with the situation that was at hand. So generally I'm looking at trends. For example, you can see in the second century the formalization of the conversion process, where they had catechumens and they would delay baptism for months. In fact, by the 3rd century, some people were delaying baptism until they're on their deathbed. They started to have this idea that if you mess up after you become a Christian, you could lose your salvation, that's pretty questionable teaching. Anyway, during the 2nd century, we start to see some of the great church writers, such as Irenaeus, and we start to see some of the early theologians, and you start to see how Irenaeus was arguably the first theologian. Irenaeus, he was Greek, but he's living in Lyon, which is the Latin-speaking part of the empire. At this time, the church was almost 100% Greek still, although Judaism had already been basically kicked out of the church. That's another story. But Irenaeus started to defend the Christian truth based not necessarily just on the Bible, but he started to defend the Christian truth based on the tradition and on the teachings of the church fathers. And in fact, it's interesting because when Irenaeus was trying to oppose Valentinus, who was a Gnostic, he found that Valentinus could use the scriptures to defend Gnosticism, and Irenaeus could use the scriptures to defend mainstream Christianity. But Irenaeus could defeat Valentinus because basically he could argue that the tradition he was teaching went back all the way to the apostles. So in that context, using tradition to defend Christian truth, it was a good argument. It worked. It did the trick. Problem is, by the 3rd and 4th century, in the 5th and 6th century, Christians were defending what they believed principally based on the tradition of the church fathers and not even on the scriptures anymore. So there's a lot of lessons that for us to how we could see trends that could come up within the Christian church as we practice today, which if extrapolated over time, even though it makes sense today, maybe over time it might actually pull us away from biblical Christianity. There's a number of examples of this. The Christian worship, which gradually became less and less spontaneous and more well-defined. And again, they were doing that to protect Christianity against false teachers. But the net result was that the average Christian had very little part in worship. And we can see how that would be a problem. So those are some of the trends we see in the 2nd century. And then in the 3rd century, the church began to continue to grow. By the 3rd century, the church had spread into Mesopotamia. In some places in Asia Minor, the Christian church was actually the majority in some areas. And in fact, the church began to be a significant threat, if you will, to the Roman state. That's what the Romans thought anyway. So, interestingly, we know about the persecutions of the church, of course. But what most Christians don't realize is the greatest persecutions by far were in the second half of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th century. That's when Diocletian attacked the church. And that's, at that point, Christianity had become a threat to the state. As much as 10 or 15% of the entire Roman Empire had been converted to Christianity. It's still a fairly small percentage, but given the polyglot of the Roman Empire, the church had become perhaps the second most powerful force within the Roman Empire. Then there's a number of important teachers in the early 3rd century. Tertullian, who was the first important Latin teacher, and Tertullian is interesting. He represents the move in the West towards more legalistic form of Christianity, Christianity based on works. He had very strong convictions about righteousness. Tertullian was the one who invented the word Trinity, and he was probably the greatest theologian of his time. He defended the view of Christ that I believe that we have, which is that he is God, and that he's fully God and fully man. So Tertullian's an interesting character to learn about. You can learn about him in my book. And then from Tertullian in Carthage, we can go to the Alexandrian school, Clement of Alexandria, Origen. Here we see early church theologians trying to explain Christianity to Greek philosophers. And I think Origen and Clement of Alexandria were very, very successful. And in fact, by the middle of the 3rd century, Christian ideas were beginning to become popular even amongst philosophers, believe it or not. And a number of philosophers came into the Christian church. So that's an interesting thing. Another important teacher in the 3rd century is Cyprian. Cyprian began to teach things that we would think of as seeming almost Roman Catholic. He taught the idea of penance, that if you sin, you have to do penance in order to come back into the church. We can see some future things that happen within Catholicism there. Cyprian began to teach, believe it or not, infant baptism. By the late 3rd century, or the mid-3rd century, infant baptism was being practiced. And so what had happened by now, they made baptism into more than it is. I mean, baptism is the point of salvation. It's the time at which salvation happens. but they made it into kind of almost like a mystical thing, right? That by doing that alone, they become a Christian, and faith began to have less importance in Christianity. Of course, you can see Roman Catholicism coming in at that point. I could say more about the 3rd century Christian culture. Here's where we start to enter a period of church history that some of us heard about. The huge persecutions under Diocletian and the rise of the Arian movement. This was a movement, a guy Arius from Alexandria began to teach that Jesus was created. He said there's a time when he was not, talking about Jesus. And that this is when Constantine was converted, around 315. And Constantine united the Roman Empire, reunited it, and he legalized Christianity. The Christian church thought this was the best thing that ever happened, but with hindsight, maybe not so great, because the joining of church and state is not a healthy thing. That's what church history tells us. If the church gets hold of political power, that's a disaster for the church. And a lot of Christians, at least where I live in America, think that we should have a Christian government and all this kind of stuff. And church history tells us we should be a bit skeptical of joining church with state. This is when the Council of Nicaea was held. You've probably heard of that. This is the one that basically opposed Arianism and established that Jesus is God, at least from the point of view of the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed. A lot of interesting things happened there. But this is when we learn about Eusebius. So Eusebius was the great church historian in the early 4th century, around 330 AD. He wrote his book. So this is the period of the great church councils, the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Ephesus. And this is the time when the church really established as a more concrete thing that the teaching of who God is, the teaching of who Jesus is. And it was a time of great victory for Christianity, but the seeds of the destruction of Christianity was in many ways laid during the 4th and early 5th century. Probably the most important individual in this period would be Augustine of Hippo. Hippo was in northern Africa, and eventually he became the Bishop of Carthage. Actually, the Bishop of Hippo, but he lived around Carthage. He was converted in his 30s, and he became the most powerful writer, theologian, especially in the Western Church. In fact, if you want to understand Roman Catholicism, just learn about Augustine of Hippo, and his influence. He preached predestination. He also preached that church and state should be equal partners in pushing Christianity. He believed in using the Christian state as a means to get rid of bad teaching. There was a Christian movement in the 4th century that was in northern Africa, and he opposed that. In fact, he used essentially the army to suppress this Christian movement, which I believe they were legitimate Christians. He didn't agree with them. But his difference with them was mainly political rather than theological. So that's an interesting time. I think it's definitely worthwhile for Christians to understand Augustine. He wrote a book, The City of God, which was a defense of his view that it was God's predestined will that the church and the state should conquer. Anyway, understanding the future of Christianity and even understanding Protestantism, you have to understand Augustine, because Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. The movement he suppressed was the Donatist movement. And these were a kind of a puritanical movement within Christianity that taught commitment, perhaps more than other church movements. Anyway, that kind of gives you a feeling. The book ends with the Council of Chalcedon, which was the one that essentially really established a view of Jesus that I think we as Christians would agree that he was fully God and fully man. Other important people to mention would be Jerome, who created the Vulgate and brought the Christian scriptures in Latin in the form that it survived in the Roman Church even today. So that's kind of a quick overview of some of the main topics. And this is the first volume of 3. I'm hoping to release another volume of church history in about 2 years. That'll cover the time, basically from the fall of Rome, more or less, through the medieval period and up through the Reformation and the establishment of the Protestant churches and the Radical Reformation.
That's a journey through history. Some great points that the people will discover in this book, because there are things that they will recognize in today's churches and religion. And I feel that we covered a lot in this interview about